Welcome to A State of Mind, a podcast where ancient wisdom meets our crazy modern world. This is Julian Royce. I hope everyone listening is staying safe and sane during these very challenging coronavirus times. I've been trying to take advantage of this time with the shutdown and everything to learn more about video and audio production, and I'm excited to share more of this content with you all. Please consider making a donation to support this podcast, patreon.com/A State of Mind. Even $5 or $10 really makes a big difference. So if you're listening to this and enjoying it, please head on over to patreon.com/A State of Mind and give us a donation. Today, I'm speaking with Ben Jaffe. Ben is someone I have wanted to have on this podcast for quite a while now. He just earned his PhD as a cultural anthropologist from CU Boulder and has translated several works from Tibetan into English with his teacher, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang. Dr. Nida is recognized as a tulku and also a Tibetan medical doctor, and he teaches around the world. And Dr. Nida is a lineage holder of the Tantric Medicine Buddha lineage, which traces itself back to 12th century Tibet. One of the really remarkable things about this lineage is that it is in part was designed for doctors who had busy lives as well as families, and who also wanted to practice in the Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhist tradition. So because of this, I think this lineage and the practices in it are really well suited for many of us today in the modern world. Many of us who want to practice meditation deeply and are also working in the world, also have families, rather than choosing the path of a monk or renunciate. Not that there's anything wrong with that choice, but many of us today are not making that choice or feel like we can't, and yet we still want to have a deep meditation practice. I highly recommend Ben's doctoral dissertation, which is entitled White Robes, Matted Hair, Tibetan Tantric Householders, Moral Sexuality, and the Ambiguities of Esoteric Buddhist Expertise in Exile. It is really fascinating. I'll see if I can post a link to that on the website for the podcast. Today, my conversation with Ben really focuses on a book that he edited and translated called Karmamudra, Sexuality in Tibetan Medicine and Buddhism by Dr. Nida. I'll hold up a picture of it here. The word Karmamudra literally means something like action seal, and in this context refers to sexual yoga practices, which are a part of the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition. And one of the remarkable things about this book is that it is dedicated to survivors of sexual abuse. And Ben and I discussed this in our conversation together, so I won't repeat it all here, but I think this motivation is really wonderful. There unfortunately have been a number of sexual scandals in spiritual groups around the world, including Buddhist groups. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you know I've had 3 episodes up to this point on the Shambhala organization and the abuses that happened there, which are really terrible. So rather than avoiding the topic of sexuality because of abuses like this, I personally really agree with Ben and Dr. Nida that openly and honestly discussing sexuality is actually part of the answer. Giving people some important context and background information about the traditional role that sexual yoga can play in the Buddhist path could actually help prevent abuse from happening. You know, as it said, knowledge is power. Another point to make here is that Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that all the schools of Buddhism from Tibet practice, is founded on having a compassionate motivation. So if someone doesn't have an authentically compassionate motivation to help others, then by definition, that person is no longer doing a Buddhist practice. They're no longer on the path. Another point I wanted to make here is that there are many different methods, many different ways of practicing that are offered in this Buddhist tradition, and none are really better or worse. It's simply a matter of finding out what works for you. Another thing that I appreciate about this book is it makes these teachings accessible to everyone, whether you're a Buddhist or not, and it has very inclusive language. It offers ways of practicing and teachings for example, for gay people, transgender people, intersex people as well. And I think this is one of the ways in which our modern contemporary world, actually has something to offer this ancient tradition, that we can make it more inclusive. So another thing I like about this book is how it really honors the ancient tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism. And in fact, it doesn't give detailed instructions or give away, secret knowledge per se. Doesn't give detailed instructions on advanced yogic practices, but it gives a good job of putting it in historical context and giving introductory, accessible practices that anyone can learn from, can benefit from, and can adapt to their own lives. Another thing, in the beginning of this book, it lists several misconceptions, common myths about Karmamudra practice, and kind of tries to dispel them. So I'll just read some of these. I'll read these here quickly. Misconception number 1, Karmamudra is so secret, it can never be discussed. Well, I think the fact that this book has come out is refuting that myth. Misconception 2, Karmamudra is a lost or dying tradition. Dr. Nida himself, grew up in a Tantric Buddhist culture where these kinds of practices were done. Misconception number 3, Karmamudra is the same thing as Karma Sutra. Karma Sutra is the treatise on desire. And one of the most persistent and common misconceptions about Karma Sutra is that it is a Tantric teaching. So originally in the Indian and then Tibetan context, Karma Sutra was not particularly Tantric. It was offered to everyone, and it says here in this book, it was the art of worldly sex, versus Karmamudra, which is the art of more spiritual practice, spiritual orgasm. Misconception number 4, to practice Karmamudra, you need to have many different partners. So that's another misconception. You can do these kinds of practices when you're married. And misconception number 5, Karmamudra is patriarchal. It exists only to exploit and abuse women and to empower heterosexual men. I think this book, again, does a good job of talking about some of these issues. And, Tibetan culture, like many traditional pre-modern cultures, is patriarchal. The word for woman in Tibetan literally means something like lower born, so that's not good. But in the Tantric teachings, it teaches that we must really respect women, and that women have a special, in some ways, maybe closer to wisdom than men. It actually has teachings like that. And so, let's see. Misconception number 6, Karmamudra is about lofty and abstract spiritual things. It has nothing to do with ordinary people like me. I think this is another important myth to dispel. If you are someone who has a sex life and you're a meditator or a Buddhist, I think it's important to try to bring those things together. The ideal of mindfulness practice is that, and meditation practice is that it can touch and include all the different areas of our life. It's not something that we should compartmentalize, and cut off from the rest of our life. We want to expand our presence and our mindfulness practice to include everything. And then myth number 7, almost no one is qualified to practice Karmamudra. And that's another interesting point. I'm hoping to have Ben back on the podcast again. So if you have questions about this, send them my way, and I can hopefully ask him those in the future. But again, this book and the Medicine Buddha lineage in particular, the Yutak Nyingteg, has different practices that are accessible for everyone, not just for people doing long extended retreats, doing really advanced kind of yogic practices. So I wanted to give this little introduction, give it some context. Ben has a wealth of information and knowledge to offer, so I hope you really enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And without further ado, I bring you Ben Jaffe. here today with Ben Jaffe. Ben, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we've tried to do this at least one other time, and it was a technical disaster, so I'm glad we're getting to do it again.
Yeah.
Hopefully our connection is better this time. And let's see, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? You just earned a PhD from University of Colorado, right?
Yeah, University of Colorado Boulder. So I am a doctor of cultural anthropology. I'm South African born and bred, but I came to the US in 2010, the fall of 2010, to begin that PhD program. So some people kind of gasp when they hear that because, well, that's almost 10 years, but not actually that unusual. I got the PhD in November of last year, and it's kind of normal for a cultural anthropology PhD to take about at least 7 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so I'm a doctor of cultural anthropology, and I specialize in the anthropological study of Tibet and Tibetan and Himalayan societies, and specifically Tibetan Buddhism. I'm particularly interested in the contemporary globalization of Tibetan esoteric Buddhism and Tibetan Tantra or Vajrayana practices. More broadly, I have a long-standing personal and professional interest in the study and practice of magic and of esoteric religious traditions.
Right. That's one of the things I appreciate about you. You have some understanding of esoteric traditions from the West, from Europe, so to speak, and also in Tibet. And you learn Tibetan language. So you lived for a period of time in India.
Yeah, that's right. As an anthropologist, we are required sort of just solely for the technical purposes of our PhD process, but also because anthropologists will generally tell you it's essential that you do extended field work. We're required to do at least 12 sort of continuous months of field work in situ. Now, in practice, people might have multiple field sites. Some of their field sites might be virtual. Right now, with the global pandemic, I have several colleagues and friends who were actually in the field completing intensive doctoral field work who have now had to leave wherever it was that they were. So they're really having to rethink their plans and maybe even the whole model of anthropology, which emphasizes so much, immersive field work. But yeah, so I was doing field work in various places in various ways. All through 2015 and 2016, I was in mostly North India. And then I spent 6 months in Kathmandu as well. I also did a lot of research and interviews in the US too with lamas and sort of non-heritage Buddhist communities and converts there, just kind of in a little less structured way, just over the years as I was involved with different groups.
Yeah. And some of that's in your thesis, which is an amazing document. I recommend it for people.
Yeah, the dissertation that got me my PhD qualification is called White Robes, Matted Hair, Tibetan Tantric Householders, Moral Sexuality and the Ambiguities of Esoteric Buddhist Expertise in Exile. So a little bit of a mouthful. We anthropologists, we have this tendency that is so common now in writing journal articles and theses that we will have some sort of catchy, maybe slightly difficult to pass poetic shorter title and then a colon with this mean, intimidating breakdown that comes after.
Well, it's the discipline of anthropology is, in my mind, a little bit of a romantic one. And I got an undergrad degree in anthropology and religious studies, and I kind of fantasized about living and doing, going down the PhD track, and I didn't. But it takes a certain dedication, and then there's not, it's not exactly a big career move. You're putting in like 10 years working on this PhD. But it's amazing. I think it really helps build bridges between cultures, and I think it really increases our appreciation for humanity and all the diversity and complexity So I think it's amazing work.
Absolutely. I mean, it certainly is romantic. You're right. And some people would say foolhardy, because, in this economy, you're going to encourage people to do, uh, to, engage in forms of specialization and professional qualification that require them to, um, move to other countries, secure visas, put other responsibilities potentially on hold. It's a big ask for a lot of people. And
Yeah,
many anthropologists have pointed this out, that perhaps when universities looked a little different, when there was funding coming in different ways, or when the global economy looked different, it might be more viable to suggest this as the kind of backbone of research. But it's difficult because the discipline of anthropology has always said that we believe that you can learn something about human experience by a certain kind of engagement, by through an immersive, long-term,
right.
slow, serendipitous, haphazard relating to other people, by making your own body, your own mind, your own emotions, and your own relationships the barometer of measurement in your research. So that's a very unique
Interesting.
thing. The question remains how viable it is for a lot of people to do that, or whether it's a sort of privilege or luxury to be able to do that, and who gets funding and what is required of them to be able to get that funding. Other people who might be able to do excellent field work who are not getting that funding because they're not in the right universities, or they haven't had the right socialization. And
Yeah, it takes a certain privilege to do it.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of things to think about. I'm very happy that I got to do that.
Okay.
And actually, I sort of used, for me, like I always understood scholarship as being about my own interests in my life as well. It provided me a window into relating critically, but sort of intimately, to subjects that I was interested in. So,
yeah. What was the experience of learning and speaking Tibetan language? Must have opened up a lot of doors for you and given you, and living in that culture in India for a while, like allowed you to kind of become something more of an insider, even though you're not ethnically Tibetan, obviously, but it gives you a window into that culture in a way that most of us don't get to have.
Well, I think it's easy to overinflate that. I don't consider myself like perfectly fluent in Tibetan, and I don't think it's that awe-inspiring to learn another language. So many people who are not fancy academics learn other languages every day because of necessity. In anthropology, it's kind of just a given that we would have proficiency in languages that are relevant to our research, even if it's not a language in the sort of popularly understood sense, but maybe it's in my case, I had to learn expertise in Tibetan generally, but also get expertise in the language of esoteric Buddhism, for example, which is its own kind of world of understanding. And so, every researcher, every anthropologist is going to have to think about what kinds of languages at what level they're going to get expertise in, just to accomplish the bare minimum of their work. For me, it was an interesting experience because I put so much attention and energy onto learning colloquial Tibetan, and then had because I imagined that the bulk of my research was going to be everyday conversation. But then as time went on, I realized that if I wanted to understand Tibetan Buddhism, this is a thoroughly textual tradition. It has an enormous body of textual knowledge associated with it. And I was weary of becoming a textualist scholar who made what I thought was the kind of ridiculous decision to try to study religious texts in isolation from their everyday lived contexts of use. But I also realized that I couldn't exactly be asking, in-depth probing questions to religious specialists about their tradition, which is so connected with specific texts and lineages of textual and oral tradition, if I didn't even know how to read Tibetan or move through a specialist text. So that was something I ended up having to teach myself to read in a very sort of haphazard way, largely by myself, and just by spending time with Tibetans and learning to read and make that connection between written and spoken language. Because
what drew you to studying Tibetan culture and language in particular?
I mean, like all anthropologists, I would say that it probably amounts to a series of random and not so random serendipitous events. I have a long-standing interest and involvement, as you mentioned, in Western esoteric traditions and Western magical practices and neo-paganism. And I'd been exposed in South Africa, where I'm from, to Buddhism and to Tibet, but not to any great degree. And I became more interested in Buddhism and Buddhists, non-heritage Buddhists, and how they were adapting, how they were living and adapting and grappling with a religious tradition, which on the one hand is absolutely, unambiguously and undeniably a universalist religious tradition, a missionary religious tradition. People will get very rankled when I call Buddhism like a hyper-evangelical religion.
Hyper-evangelical?
Yeah, because they think of that word, evangelos, someone who spreading the good news, as they associate it in their minds with a very kind of specific type of Christian missionizing. But
there's been a lot of negativity from that kind of racism or colonialism and all that connected.
Exactly. But Buddhist missionizing has been aggressive historically. It's just unfolded in somewhat different ways. And I often explain to people, well, when you say prayers that beings may achieve Buddhahood or have exposure to the Buddha Dharma, you're not even limiting that to your fellow human beings. You're engaging in practices and aspirations which hope that in direct and indirect ways, even invisible microbes and spirits and ants can be exposed to Buddha Dharma and thereby benefit in this life.
Even the coronavirus can become enlightened.
Well, perhaps, yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people are grappling right now with the ontological question of what is a virus? Is a virus a sentient being? Right. Is it a tool of sentient beings? How do we relate to it, and so on?
But you're making a good point about the evangelical nature of Tibetan Buddhism, and I realized that when I lived in India and I went to Sikkim. I was in India for about 5-6 months, and it was a study abroad program when I was an undergrad, and I heard these stories of how the Buddha Dharma came to Sikkim, these yogis who flew through the air and subjugated the land and taught the Dharma, and I realized that it was a missionary story. I was hearing a story of how these people were kind of converted and how Tibetan Buddhism came to dominate the area. And there's actually native indigenous people there that were kind of, their traditions were kind of put down,
Right, and you often find in these kind of border regions in the sort of Tibetan cultural universe that have been Buddhicized, you often find that process of Buddhicization is sort of ongoing and incomplete. Where despite the fact that what people think of as Tibetan Buddhism having been normalized in those places, or having become, hegemonic, this idea that it's become sort of normal and everyday and unquestioned. Despite that fact, the Himalayan border regions, they still experience new waves of kind of Tibetan Buddhist evangelists who may want to correct what they see as folk misunderstandings or orientations towards Buddhism, and kind of remind, often sort of Himalayan ethnicities who are Buddhicized, but are seen as perhaps like not practicing Tibetan Buddhism in quite the same way. They can often become foils in the discourses of visiting Tibetan lamas. It's like, be careful of becoming like a village tamang practitioner who practices Tibetan, or let's say Buddha Dharma, generally with devotion, but maybe blind faith, and needs because they haven't had training in Buddhist philosophy or a certain kind of education. So there's sort of cultural politics around these things too. But yeah, I just to return to my earlier point, what I was saying is that what I've always been really interested in personally and as a researcher is how do, it's about cross-cultural engagements with Buddha Dharma. I was in South Africa and there was a small but very sort of devoted community of non-heritage Buddhists, mostly white, upper middle class South Africans. And I was always interested right from the beginning of my direct exposure to sort of Tibetan Buddhist centers and so on around the world. On the one hand, you have this, you have Buddha Dharma, which goes beyond kind of historical, cultural social labels. It spans time and space in particular ways. And as I said, it's a universalist kind of missionary faith that we're talking about. But on the other hand, Tibetan Buddhism is also Tibetan Buddhism and Himalayan Buddhism. And it emerges from specific cultural, social, historical contexts. And so I've always been curious about the challenges and opportunities that present themselves in a form of Buddhism that is sort of developed in particular sort of socioeconomic environments or political universes or cultural worlds being transmitted into very different ones. And so I sort of got involved in Tibetan studies because I ended up, through a series of events, doing 6 months of master's field work for an MA in social anthropology from the University of Cape Town. I discovered that there were, in total in 2009, 3 Tibetan families living in South Africa and possibly the African continent. And I went and interned with the Tibet office or Tibet house. It's kind of the Tibetan exile administration, a central Tibetan administration or government, although the terminology has changed in the last few years. They operate these Tibet houses, kind of de facto embassies to manage local Tibetan refugee exile populations.
I think there's one in New York City, right?
Right. I think a very prominent one is there. Tibet as a nation state isn't recognized right now in any official capacity. It's been erased from the map as a result of aggressive Chinese colonialism.
Right.
And, so these kinds of organizations sort of function, like I said, as de facto platforms through which exiled Tibetans can liaise with foreign governments and keep the issue of the Tibetan freedom movement alive. But yeah, I ended up meeting and spending a lot of time during that period with the representatives who'd been sent from the CTA, from the exile administration based in Dharamsala in India, to South Africa to kind of man this office in suburbia without a large kind of population of fellow Tibetan refugees at all. So
that's interesting.
They were mostly interacting as ethnic Tibetans and political officials with foreigners who'd converted to Tibetan Buddhism, but whose relationships with the Tibetan political movement, Tibetan culture, Tibetan history were different, and their priorities were different. So I was really interested in sort of tracing those points of intersection and divergence. And I've continued to be really interested in the spread of what on the one hand is indigenous traditional knowledge and esoteric traditions. And on the other hand is, the religious practices of a universalist faith. Right. And then how are those sort of simultaneously operating and what are the cultural dimensions? When do people emphasize culture and politics? When do they disown them? It's all quite interesting to me. I'm interested in esoteric Buddhism in general, and just the nature of the practices and their kind of internal logic and power. But I'm also interested in the kind of the social historical context in which they circulate and are taken up and reinterpreted, rejected, cause anxiety, create opportunity, new perspectives and insights. So I've always been interested in that dimension of Buddha Dharma and of spiritual practice. And so anthropology was sort of a good environment from which
part of the universalism of Tibetan Buddhism is it, for the most part, traces itself entirely back to India. And we could debate that, from modern scholarship, because there are a lot of indigenous Tibetan elements there, but it has that kind of origin story and some truth to that, right? So it kind of sees itself, at least to some degree, as carrying this Indian Buddhism tradition out into the world.
Right. And of course, like you said, there was a period of time when Buddhism was new and suspicious and foreign and, aggressively missionizing potentially or struggling to establish itself in Tibet as well.
Right.
And I mentioned it in various places in my dissertation, but the more I sort of looked into contemporary issues or points of tension in the sort of spread of Tibetan Vajrayana around the world, the more I realized that a lot of these issues and sort of anxieties and opportunities and new developments, they had analogs in, way back in the way that Buddha Dharma spread in Tibet and the kind of challenges and institutional politics or lack thereof that were governing the spread of Dharma then. So I always think like a long historical consciousness is really useful for making sense of problems that may legitimately be startlingly new or unprecedented in some ways. But I think having a kind of historical context and that sort of long view really it provides something in making sense of contemporary issues as well in the globalization or spread of Tibetan Buddhism and so on.
Well, I tend to see the spread of Buddhism in general as a positive thing, but I think it's very worthwhile to look at it critically too, and that's part of why I wanted to have you on the podcast. And there has been a number of scandals now, often involving sex in Tibetan Buddhist communities here in America and around the world. And so you came out with this book called Karmamudra, the Yoga of Bliss, and I'll put a link to it on the website with Dr. Nida Chenagtsang. And I think it was published a couple years ago now, right?
Let's see, published. My sense of Corona quarantine has affected my sense of flow of time significantly. Yeah, it was towards the end of 2018 that we published the book. I began working on the project closely with Dr. Nida Chenagtsang, who's my personal teacher and main research collaborator, in 2016, while I was in the midst of doing PhD fieldwork. But the book itself came out toward the end of 2018.
How did you originally meet him or get to know him?
Well, so I mentioned the title of my dissertation, but I didn't exactly explain its focus. The first part of the subtitle was Tibetan Tantric Householders, which was my way of glossing what Tibetans call ngakpa. It's easy to explain them in Tibetan because there's one word that describes them. A bit more mouthy or wordy in English. Ngakpa are non-monastic, non-celibate tantric householders, or tantric yogis, or yogi householders. They are professionally religious individuals. They hold religious vows just as monks and nuns do.
And when you say householder, you mean they have a family, right?
They don't have to have a family, but they're not beholden to the same rules of celibacy as a professional monk or nun might be, right? So lay practitioners can simply have lay Buddhist vows and not be involved in high-level esoteric tantric yogic practices. Or lay people can opt to live a monk or nun-like celibate life without actually being ordained as monks and nuns. But Ngakpa ngakpa and monks. So we hear in Tibetan, historically, with the coming of Buddha Dharma to Tibet, two sort of founding communities of religious practitioners. In Tibetan, they say the deni. The two communities of vow holders were established by the Buddhism patronizing kings, and according to legend, by Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava, the Tantric saint and enlightened Buddha who sort of really firmly established Buddhism and allowed it to flourish in Tibet from the 8th century. He himself was a ngakpa. So, whereas monks and nuns, as part of their vows and commitments, will wear certain robes and shave their hair, ngakpa householder yogis and then yoginis will typically keep their hair long, sometimes let their hair dread as well as part of their religious commitments, which indicates that they are, in a sense, professional religious specialists and committed to religious practice, but they are not celibate monastic renouncers.
So in that culture, when you see someone with dreadlocks, it carries quite a bit of significance.
Right, and it does, absolutely. And it's complicated because, there are also certain yogis and yoginis who are doing advanced tantric yogic practices involving the subtle body and physical yogic training and meditation and things like this in Tibetan and Himalayan societies, who may have long dreaded hair, but who are in fact living celibate lives in retreat and don't have families. They're yogis, but Ngakpa tend to be historically and in the broader cultural scheme, they're kind of locus classicus. They're the typical place you'd expect to find them is not living permanently in a kind of centralized religious educational institution like full-time, like a monk or nun. Where you typically find them is living with family in the village, or whatever that particular context might be.
Right.
But also occasionally spending time in retreat, in closed retreat, mastering certain forms of tantric ritual expertise, which they then typically offer to their lay community, as well as to monastic authorities occasionally as well. So Ngakpa is especially associated with the kind of aggressive, wrathful ritual expertise and deity yoga practices of the Maha-yoga class of tantras.
Oh, interesting.
Of the inner yoga tantra categories in the old school of Tibetan Buddhism, Maha and Ati yoga.
Let's slow down a little bit here. I mean, part of what is fascinating about this is many people who are practicing Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism here in this country, in the United States or around the world today, modern people are kind of Ngakpas, right? Like it's a good model. Like it's kind of something that I think needs to be talked about more because it kind of fits the description of people who are working or have a family and are also doing these kinds of practices.
Right. Well, this whole issue of tantric yogic householders is very interesting, especially as you say in terms of the spread of Tibetan Buddhism around the world. Because like I mentioned, right from the advent of Buddhism in Tibet, you have these two very clearly demarcated and very clearly sort of legitimized communities of different types of vow holders, which have completely different ways of organizing themselves socially, economically, completely different sets of vows or sort of daily activities. And yet they're both described as being legitimate objects for the giving of merit-creating offerings. They're both described as being sort of same but different. Equally legitimate communities of dedicated religious practitioners who you can give, like, in a traditional Buddhist society, if you're a layperson, you make offerings to the monastery and this accrues merit and so on. Ngakpa as householder specialists, religious specialists and vow holders are described kind of categorically as being an equivalent, an equal community of that kind.
That's fascinating, and that tends to get lost in translation, I think. Like, if people don't have that popular understanding.
It gets lost in translation because, and I was just listening to an interview with Ian Baker, who's another scholar practitioner of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. And he was pointing out something that he's not alone pointing this out, but, a lot of the practices of non-dual Tantra, be they Shaiva Tantric practices in India or Vajrayana Buddhist Tantric practices in India, many of these practices, when you read the foundational scriptures, when you look at the historical context in which these practices came, I think it's safe to say that some of them emerged from a context in which it was assumed that the people who were becoming initiated into higher, more advanced tantric yogi practices were householders, even should be householders.
That's fascinating.
Because these practices required sexuality. Historically, in order to get initiated into highest yoga tantra practices in Vajrayana,
they were kind of co-opted by the monastic traditions a little bit later historically.
Right. So I'm hesitant to say, it's a complicated history to say co-opted as if they existed, beyond the scope of monastic expertise or institutions, and then they were just completely absorbed. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Early on in India, we see this incredibly complex sort of back and forth between communities of yogis who are much more decentralized and who are mostly beholden to gurus, and communities of co-initiates and who might be householders who have kids and a family and so on. And then these sort of monastic institutions seeking royal patronage and so on. And there's a complicated back and forth. We hear frequently that experts start in one domain and then shift to another, or back and forth again. Yogis become charismatic leaders who then might found lineages or centralized religious institutions. So it's a complicated back and forth along this kind of central binary, these two different orientations of practice. And just to get back to your question about sort of ambiguity or confusion in sort of the westward spread of Dharma, I mean, there are different ways to understand what a ngakpa is. So on the one hand, there's kind of what I call the general or kind of more inclusive definition of ngakpa, which really, as the word itself tells you, ngak in Tibetan means mantra or tantra. So ngakpa is the tantric the mantra. It's a person who is doing tantra and doing mantras and reciting mantras and making them work and using them. So there's a kind of broad definition of ngakpa. On the one hand, anyone who's initiated into highest yoga tantra practices in Vajrayana, anyone who's doing sort of esoteric, non-dual tantric Buddhist practices is a tantrika, is a ngakpa. But historically, culturally, in the context of Tibetan and Himalayan societies, ngakpa has a much more specific meaning. It tends to imply a male hereditary ritual specialist, a non-monastic expert in certain kinds of tantric rituals who inherited sort of tantric professionalization, often in a hereditary way, but not exclusively, and is often sort of a village ritual specialist or, performing rites of healing or exorcism or controlling spirits.
When you say inherited, it's from their family, like a family lineage.
It's a family lineage, not exclusively, but typically.
Okay.
And so, you have this phenomenon where I mentioned this briefly in my dissertation, like I would say to ethnic Tibetan friends of mine who are, heritage Buddhists who are born into Buddhism, and to Tibetan Buddhist culture, I would say, even just uttering the words Inji Ngakpa, like a white, someone who seems white or Western, a white Westerner who's a Ngakpa, some Tibetans couldn't really even compute that idea for various reasons, because they understood that it was unlikely that converts to Tibetan Buddhism in, say, the US, white people, could have had the same depth or breadth of tantric ritual training.
They didn't grow up with it.
Didn't grow up with it, didn't have family members who grew up with it, and then also probably hadn't done extensive, lengthy retreats. So for a lot of Tibetans, it's not enough to simply say that you're a Ngakpa because you practice or are involved with Tantric Buddhism, or you've received empowerments or initiations for practices. Ngakpa kind of implies that you're a vocational expert or specialist. You've devoted your life to gaining some kind of ritual expertise that you then are expected to kind of offer to your communities to help them heal sickness, control the weather, banish demons, and so on. And so the idea that non-Tibetans or people who are non-heritage Buddhists could be that. They say, well, of course, maybe they look like Ngakpa. Maybe they have been initiated and are attempting to hold the vows, but there's some sort of, some Tibetans I met would chortle when they even heard those two words put together as if it was sort of an oxymoron or even a punchline to a joke. But of course, there was a time when...
Even within Tibetan culture, it's easy to kind of make fun of the Ngakpa because there's maybe less of the sanctity of the monastic robes and things like that.
Absolutely. The figure of the Ngakpa historically and culturally, it's really interesting because on the one hand, you have these, Sangye Niba, the second Buddha, Padmasambhava, who himself was a Ngakpa, practicing sexual yoga, doing non-celibate practices, he was a thaumaturge, performing acts of tantric efficacy, of magic, controlling and binding spirits, and he's revered as sort of one of the most important figures in Tibetan Buddhism. And yet, on the other hand, the village Ngakpa often gets a raw deal, sort of positioned against the monk and seen as maybe like falling short, having less like literacy or knowledge of Tibetan philosophy, or maybe they have real power as a result of doing deity yoga practices, but maybe their motivations are a bit dodgy. Maybe they have actualized siddhis, mundra power through tantric yoga, but maybe we can't be sure that their motivations are the best, or that they aren't just doing rituals by rote, for example, to make a living, or maybe they're misusing their siddhis for less than noble purposes. So there's always this kind of ambiguity that's almost baked into the figure of the Ngakpa, because they kind of shift between social spaces and categories, and can be a little bit threatening, because they often, they're doing high-level practices while also, in some cases, seeming to live a very sort of they're not under any sort of centralized authority necessarily. They're beholden primarily to their gurus and family of co-initiates, and they don't have the same oversight. And this is sort of a pro and a con in various ways.
Right.
But just, sorry, to finish responding to your question. Yeah, I mean, technically speaking, any person who attends a wang, an empowerment, a highest yoga tantra empowerment, who is not a monk, who receives that practice, intends to uphold the vows and practice that sort of yidam sadhana associated with the initiation, they are a ngakpa in the sense that they are an initiated practitioner of tantric yoga and they're non-monastic and non-celibate. But whether it's appropriate for them to call themselves a ngakpa, or whether they're equivalent to maybe what native Tibetans might think of as a qualified ngakpa, this was a sort of question that a lot of people were asking and answering differently, and I talk a lot about this in the dissertation. But how does this relate to this book? Well, I helped edit this book and put it together, but it's really the teachings and the words of my teacher, Dr. Nida, and he is a ngakpa from northeastern Tibet, from Amdo.
And also a medical doctor, right?
Yeah, also a practitioner of Sorikpa, Tibetan traditional medicine. And he comes from a community in Tibet, a long-standing, very large, probably the largest, sort of longest-standing community of Ngakpa and Ngakma, female equivalent. Although we can talk more about terminology and gender, it's an interesting question. But yeah, I met Dr. Nida because he writes so much about Ngakpa traditions and lineages as a scholar practitioner of them himself. And, he teaches globally. He has students in Tibet, outside of Tibet, all over the world. And for the last few years, he's been unusually open about talking about sexual yoga practices, tantric sex practices, which historically, I mean, these are the things that, if there was any practitioner who's most associated with the incorporation of sexuality and sex into the spiritual path, it is Ngakpa and related non-celibate tantric specialists who use sexuality as part of Buddhist practice.
That's an interesting idea to a lot of people. It's surprising. I mean, there's a lot of taboos around sexuality in general in our culture, and then when you bring spirituality in, it becomes a very charged subject. I want to read, if it's okay with you, the dedication at the beginning of the book. That we could talk about that, but it says, "I would like to dedicate this book to all victims of sexual abuse, and especially to those who have been abused in the name of spiritual and religious traditions. May the pain and suffering caused by sexual abuse swiftly cease in every corner of this earth. Dr. Nida Chenagtsang." And so the motivation for why coming out with the book about sexual yoga in Vajrayana Buddhism, which is considered very secret and esoteric generally, and that's part of the motivation for it. And I think that's a beautiful motivation. And one of the things we were going to talk about is how many people kind of maybe had the opposite reaction when they hear about it. They're like, this isn't the time to be talking about sacred sexuality because this is a time when these scandals have happened. But I agree with Dr. Nida that because of these scandals, now is a good time to talk about what actual sacred sexuality, sexual yoga would actually look like, what it actually is.
Right. So, I think Dr. Nida and my position is pretty clear from the fact that we published this book. Our primary motivation was for this book to be educational. Historically, the use of sort of partnered tantric sexual yoga practices falls into a very sort of high echelon of practice within Vajrayana. It's not typically understood as something for everyone, and it's often been highly secret. And it's interesting, though, because as I mentioned, historically, the price of admission into highest yoga tantra, into Vajrayana advanced tantric yogic practices was engagement with sexuality. Historically, an initiation into Yidam practice for tantric Buddhists meant actually having.
Can you spell that out a little bit more? Like historically, when someone became initiated, that would involve some kind of sexual act, or
right. So now, many people will attend Wang, is the name in Tibetan, initiations, which sort of allow them a sort of kind of spiritual entry point into the mandala, into the practice of a tantric Buddha deity. It allows them to. It's sort of a central ceremonial mystery that they're exposed to, and which allows them to then sort of begin practicing on the tantric path under the supervision of a guru and so on. Tantric vows are kind of embedded in the initiation rite itself too. Vows specific to those tantric practices and so on. Today, when many people attend Wang or initiations today, in Tibetan and Himalayan societies, they're often actually giant communal events. And many people who attend these initiations have no intention of, engaging daily with these practices as part of their spiritual discipline. They're going for other reasons, to receive blessings from being in the presence of the Lama. Historically, we know that it used to be much more select and smaller groups who would meet under cover of darkness and would be initiated by gurus with a cohort of co-initiates. And a lot of the practices which in the past, say like 9th century India, for example, 10th century India, may have been literally engaged in. For example, actually having sex with a ritual sex partner, consuming actual sexual substances produced through that activity. Many of those elements of the initiation rite have been interiorized and made more symbolic, which then also allows increasingly for the involvement of monastics in these practices as well. So it's possible today to go to an initiation which might authorize you to begin taking up a sadhana or a regular practice of a tantric deity where, you know, no one is drinking fresh commingled sexual fluids or witnessing or experiencing tantric sex in any form, even though there are elements within the ceremony, symbolic elements within the ceremony that substitute for those literal practices.
So historically, would the guru be having sex with his consort as part of the initiation, or would everyone who is receiving the initiation have a partner?
We have some historical evidence from texts and commentaries from India that sort of points us toward understanding how these things worked in practice. You know, if you're a householder yogi, your consort is typically your husband or wife. The initiant, the person about to be initiated, may have brought their own partner with them, or they might have they might engage in sexual yoga with a more experienced individual, like their guru, their guru's wife. Or we know that this looked different in different ways, in different contexts, and we also know that even quite early on, Indian Vajrayana exegetes were recognizing that they themselves didn't always practice these things literally, or maybe out in the open, or they had a certain flexibility and an understanding that there was actually quite vociferous debate within the Buddhist context, because monasticism and institutionalized monasticism and monastic learning was so fundamental to Buddhist religious communities, not as much to Shaiva religious communities in the same way. So Shaiva tantrikas who did engage with sexual yoga practices seem to have the same sort of anxiety or angst historically as Buddhist tantric yogis and yoginis have had about the question of celibacy, the question of literally performing things like sexual yoga and so on. But I bring that up because we know that things look different at different times. So as time goes on, more or less emphasis is placed on different ways of engaging with practices. Today, you know, there are Ngakpa, there are communities of Ngakpa, there are Tibetan treasure revealers for whom sexual yoga practice with physical partners is essential to their own spiritual activities.
And could you say a little bit more about that tradition of?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting in Tibet, probably more than any other place where Buddhism has gone ever. In Tibet, we see this incredible flourishing of institutionalized, state-sponsored monasticism and monastic education, alongside this incredible flourishing of Tantric Buddhism and also non-celibate forms of practice. You kind of get as much of all kinds, every part of the spectrum as you could hope for. A sort of
like the whole society was very supportive of spiritual practice in general.
And of both those sort of orientations, like I said, the two fundamental communities and approaches, and sometimes there's clashes and tensions and disagreements, but often it was more of a sort of complicated back and forth and across those boundaries and orientations. So treasure revealers are really fascinating and important part of Tibetan religious history and contemporary religious life. Tertan, treasure revealers, is a kind of a direct translation, are individuals, 9 out of 10 times, non-celibate, non-monastic religious specialists who are kind of visionary prophets who experience past life memories of a time when in previous incarnations they sat at the feet of the great original Ngakpa Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, in the early days of Buddhism in Tibet, and received initiations and the transmission of teachings from him. And the idea is that he seeded both physical relics and sort of the words and teachings of texts in the mind streams of his original group of disciples, who subsequently would be reborn, and then through various triggering alignments of events and conditions would be able to resurface what seemed like new scriptures, new teachings, especially karmically relevant to the particular conditions in which that treasure revealer found themselves, in which they lived in that incarnation, but not really new either, because these sort of, for the want of a better word, channeled texts or visionarily revealed texts were not actually new. They had been seeded in the past, and they were only just being uncovered or from having been buried in the psyches of treasure revealers. And so the reason why treasure revealers are so connected to sexual yoga practice is that as the unique contours of the treasure tradition developed in Tibet, I mean, there were models for it in India. The idea of being able to uncover texts, reveal texts and so on, or hidden texts, but it definitely has developed into a uniquely Tibetan cultural institution or complex. But the reason why tantric sex is associated so much with tertans is because in order to access in very refined, subtle states of non-conceptual mind, which are enable these religious specialists to sort of uncover and download these termas, these treasure texts and new teachings. Sexual yoga is understood to be one of the most efficient ways to sort of re-enter that non-conceptual state in which the teachings were first received and seeded, and to manipulate the subtle channels, to open them and manipulate them in certain ways to allow for this kind of gushing forth of inspiration of this new text that sort of appears fully formed for treasure revealers once all the conditions are right. So you typically hear, there's various prophetic texts that describe future tertans, and tertans have allotted consorts, be they male or female treasure revealers. They then typically have karmically destined individuals. I guess, we could call them soulmates, people whose subtle anatomy is understood to sort of perfectly match their own, and in the right place and at the perfect time, by engaging in sort of internal the internal alchemy of tantric yoga, and especially sexual yoga, they can create the conditions, the psychic conditions, as well as the external conditions in which to sort of make themselves a medium for the reception of this treasure, which was supposed to be revealed in this moment to benefit others. So
it's fascinating.
There's a strong association between the practice of literal tantric sex and the job of being a treasure revealer, to the point that it's kind of something that Tibetans will laugh about. So like, there's a crazy-eyed, long-haired treasure revealer in the village. He says he needs to find his allotted consort. How convenient for him that she's the most beautiful nubile woman in town.
Right.
And so
easy to make fun of these kinds of things.
This is part of cultural tradition, though. This is part of forms of religious practice and ways of being in the world that Dr. Nida has grown up with. And so, he recognized that he recognized several things. He recognized that a lot of people today, converts to Tibetan Buddhism, native Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, have a lot of uncertainty or confusion about the role of sexuality in Vajrayana. And he also knew from seeing several patients in the West and especially in Asia, he'd seen many women as a doctor who had come to him and had sexual problems or psychological trauma. And when he sort of sounded them out about the circumstances, he discovered that they had been coerced into abusive sexual relationships.
Terrible.
With their teachers, and had sort of felt that they had no grounds in which to resist those sorts of advances or relationships because of the dynamic between them and their teachers, or because they felt that what was happening was a sort of secret tantric sex practice, and they didn't know anything about how that worked. They knew it sort of existed, but they found themselves in this situation that he just thought was so regrettable, because as a lineage holder of sexual yoga practices, as someone who's been instructed by teachers in Tibet in this, and as a family man himself and teacher to non-celibate students, he recognizes that there's something in traditional sexual yoga practices that can really benefit people who are having sex. But he also recognizes that so many people have been exploited and abused in the name of Tantra and Tantra.
This is with indigenous Tibetan communities. He saw this?
Yes, and also with new communities that develop with non-Tibetan teachers. It's across the board.
The secrecy
primarily
can kind
wanted
of
to
further
produce
that.
this. Yes, exactly, and that's something we mentioned in the book. Traditionally, historically, the rites of initiation, the use of sexuality on the path was often quite secret. At the same time, secret and not so secret, because in the past, I'm guessing, and also in the present, if you know a lama or a dedicated practitioner of tantric yoga who has a partner who's married and has kids, then they're having sex with their partner. It's not exactly something that people can't understand. But I think that another pattern we often see is individuals who appear to be monastic in public, and then behind closed doors are engaging in sexual yoga practices, or just saying they are in order to have sex and manipulate students. So there's a lot of levels at which this is happening, and both Dr. Nida and His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama have actually said that they think it would be better if people had a clearer understanding of what differentiates those two communities: monastic renouncers, their vows, and then Ngakpa. And if things were a little bit less mixed up and confused, if the boundaries between those two communities were more clearly maintained and delineated, that would be good. So I just wanted to get back to your point about the dedication.
Right.
I do know that when we, before the book came out, when we shared screenshots of this dedication, there were a couple of individuals online who said, why on earth would you dedicate a book about tantric sexual yoga practices, as you said, to survivors of abuse in the name of those very practices? Other people said, wait, is this dedication suggesting that the solution to the trauma and harm caused through spiritual sex abuse is to do more spiritual sex? That seems very wrong-headed and kind of repulsive. And I can understand the reaction, because I've seen from experience that in a lot of neo-tantric communities in which abuse can also be rife, and manipulation and gaslighting can also be very common. You often hear that if people have already experienced some kind of trauma, sexual or otherwise, they need to submit to, they need to go beyond their sexual hang-ups. They need to submit to sexual encounters that they might normally find quite destabilizing or even unpleasant, because this is part of a necessary sort of psychological deconditioning
That's terrible. So
or spiritual process.
They use their trauma to manipulate them even more.
Right. It is a terrible thing, in my opinion. And this is absolutely not the sort of thing that we were getting at here. Dr. Nida decided to write this book, as I said, because he just kept coming across his own students and patients who had experienced abuse and manipulation and just sort of had no information to educate themselves. And he thought to himself, well, you know, I, as someone who knows about these practices, who has practiced them, and who believes that they're not simply a cover for some sort of culturally institutionalized patriarchal exploitation of women, like that is always there. That's always a real significant element of these practices and how they can be interpreted and used within particular social contexts or cultural contexts. But as far as Dr. Nida is concerned, there's no reason inherently that sexual yoga has to privilege men's interests or priorities, even if it has done so historically in patriarchal societies. There's no special reason that sexual yoga has to enable certain kinds of power dynamics or relationships. Right. So he, you know, of course, wasn't saying that people traumatized through sexual abuse should just do sexual yoga to heal themselves. Rather, he was saying that the sort of spirit that informed this book that we put together was really to honestly recognize that there has been and continues to be significant amounts of abuse in the name of spirituality. And he believes that's utterly wrong, and that it would be good if people can sort of distinguish the spiritual benefits or sort of internal logics of these practices from their sort of misinterpretation or abusive misapplication.
Yeah. So if you have some knowledge, some understanding of what the practices actually are and what it would look like, then you're kind of protected against just being abused for kind of mundane sex that you're just being used by someone. Like it would, to some degree, offer some protection, I think, and some puts it in context. I think the secrecy thing in the modern age is really interesting too. I think it can do more harm than good sometimes. And it's not about like revealing something that needs to be kept secret. It's about having like a general understanding maybe of the context. And I don't know, do you want to speak to secrecy a little bit? Because that's another big part that...
And you know, I mean, I know a lot of people kind of balked at the book because of just the Sanskrit word Karmamudra, action seal or karmic seal. The word Karmamudra technically relates to, it's a sort of the label for a physical, embodied, material sexual partner or consort. It's kind of slightly highfalutin medieval term that's often used. Dr. Nida these days will often use the word Karmamudra to kind of as a more inclusive term for like sexual yoga in general. Although technically speaking, the Karmamudra is the physical individual who is one's partner in tantric sex in the Vajrayana context. So I think, you know, like Tibetans and non-Tibetans who saw this book, they saw the word Karmamudra in the title and sort of balked, and they said, you know, well, this is above my security clearance. You know, I haven't received training in these high levels of yogic practice because, as I mentioned, historically, you know, the way that Karmamudra has kind of the literal practice of Karmamudra has survived in Tibetan societies. It's typically for virtuoso elite practitioners who've had years and years of retreat training. You know, and one of the most important kinds of trainings that allow one to then move on to effectively and properly practice sexual yoga practices is mastering Tummo yoga, inner heat yoga, which really, as we explain in the book, is kind of a sexual yoga for one. It's called Ranglu Tapten, the method that uses one's own body as the means. as opposed to sexual yoga with a partner, which is Shenlu Tapten. So,
Right. Well,
the
that's
method
interesting.
with another's body.
Yeah, interesting part of this discussion is how Karmamudra practices are so high that, like you said, the elite could do them who'd done many long retreats and achieved mastery of Tumo, and the average person, it feels very removed from them. And that's one of the beautiful parts of this book, is it, whereas it says it's a misconception to see Karmamudra as only for people who are so advanced, yogically, and who've spent many years or even decades in retreat, that we can include our sexuality in our spiritual practice as Buddhist. And that was really wonderful for me to hear, because I was one of the people who was interested in sacred sexuality and sexual yoga, but felt like the door was kind of closed in the Tibetan Buddhist world. And so I ended up looking to Taoism and to some other communities, like we talked about the One Taste community, which has this practice of clitoral stroking as a way to have like a mindful practice to engage with sexuality. I think there's a lot of people in my shoes in that. So.
Right, and the CEO of Nida even mentions it in this in the book towards the beginning. He talks about an Italian student of his who said he was a Vajrayana practitioner, and he said to him, "Well, are you practicing any kind of sexual yoga? Are you engaging with your sexuality in a kind of Tantric Buddhist manner?" And he said, "No, of course not. I can't do that. So I practice Taoist sexual alchemy practices." And he said, "But why?" So there are historical reasons why. It's an interesting thing. So I think one thing that really can't be overemphasized is that non-dual tantric traditions that teach methods for engaging with sexuality are not teaching these methods because they believe that sexuality is somehow inherently more magical than yawning or sneezing or shitting. Tantric yogic disciplines are all about not rejecting or suppressing our deeply embodied, visceral, normally destabilizing and disturbing emotional mental states, but they're about experiencing them and sitting with them and facing them and experiencing them in a non-dual way. The practice of deity yoga, learning how to conceive of oneself as the Yidam, as the meditational Buddha, is, we see these Buddhas, they're slashing throats and snarling, and their eyes are bloodshot with rage and gluttonous greed, and their sexual organs are dripping with desire. And, this can be a little disconcerting for people. But this is the orientation of non-dual tantra. It's the idea that all experience is workable, and even impure, even the experiences that monks and nuns might be vow-bound to avoid, if engaged with in a meditative, stable, well-informed way, can be understood in a non-dual fashion, can be brought onto the path. That's the term we often hear in the Buddhist context, and made useful to empower one's spiritual practice and gain realization. So the interesting thing with sexual yoga specifically, as I was saying, one thing that needs to be strongly stressed is that tantric sex in Vajrayana is just one means, one method for discovering one's own nature, for recognizing and stabilizing one's perception of the nature of being and reality. There are many yogas. There are yogas of dying. There's dream yoga, where you begin with dualistic projection, right? And then those very dualistic projections return you to non-conceptuality. So with dream yoga, you begin with your everyday experience of understanding yourself as a sovereign individual in the dream, who's separate to other dream bodies and dream people. And then by becoming lucid from inside the experience of your dream, you recognize how these sensory arisings emerge. You understand something more profoundly of their nature. You experience your experience in the dream in a non-dual way. You don't impute the dualistic existence of you and me over there in the dream. You understand that these arise as a kind of ornamental display of awareness. And you can do that with chud practice, which is a kind of yoga that works with fear and disgust. And you dissociate from your ego investments and your sense of self and body, and ultimately dissolve dualistic conceptions of self and other, enemy and friend, and so on. And sexual yoga is really no different. It's just working with sensory desire in that fashion. So when Buddhists talk about incorporating sex or sexual yoga or sensory desire or stimulation into a meditative discipline, they are simply making that aspect of embodied, natural, everyday human experience workable.
Right.
They're applying those sort of worldly experiences to the path of Buddha Dharma.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about spiritualizing sex. We're not talking about sex being even especially special. I think there's a tendency to fetishize sex, if you'll excuse the pun, to sort of turn it into a special category and invest in it and become very attached to the idea of it and so on. But, when Buddhists teach sexual yoga, they're teaching it as one means that may be useful for one person and not another.
Well,
so it's a little bit strange. It's a little bit strange. Just get back to your original question, how can this be for me? I thought this was such an elite, high secret practice. Well, it's funny because, like I said, historically, so the beginning of the path, in a way, would be being initiated, which would include instruction in sexual yoga, literal sexual yoga. At the same time, textual exegetes are often at pains to explain that one cannot practice sexual yoga for the purpose of initiation or as a meditative discipline if one fails to understand, if one fails to hold a Buddhist view, have an understanding of emptiness and the empty nature of phenomenon, and also if one fails to have a kind of a bodhicitta, a Buddhist ethical orientation in the world. So other religious groups in India were also incorporating sexuality for various reasons, various ways into their sort of spiritual technologies. And so Buddhist communities were very, very careful to point out that there's a way you can have tantric sex that's Buddhist, and there's a way you can have it that's not. And tantric sex may have incidental benefits too, worldly benefits or effects. But the way it's taught in Vajrayana is as a means to the end of progress in the Buddhist path.
Yeah.
But it's a bit strange because so you often hear a lot of talk about, here are the qualifications or conditions that one has to fulfill in order to even begin to consider practicing sexual yoga. But then in other places you'll say, sexual yoga is for people who are beset by desire, by worldly sensory desire. And it's a very effective way for less qualified practitioners who are engaging in sensory desire to work. It's like if you have dreams, right? If you're given to many dreams and nightmares, then it makes sense for you to work with dream yoga.
That's a great point. I love that.
That's your experience. So I have joked a little bit when we put this book out by saying kind of one of the best pieces of news I can imagine getting, one of the best sort of reader reactions from this book, is someone reading this and being like, oh yeah, I don't think sexual yoga is for me. I don't think sensory or sexual desire is something that is really front and center in my samsaric experience. And maybe it's not the most useful thing for me to work with to better understand my mind and to deepen my appreciation of Buddhist teachings. So, there are many, this is what is always said about Vajrayana, there's many methods. And they have to be applied skillfully and carefully under guidance.
Right.
And so Dr. Nida really wanted, this is another thing to point out. Like, there is some practical instruction in here. We provide some small meditation techniques that Dr. Nida feels are safe for anyone, even non-Buddhists, to try out, to work with their kind of embodied experience of arousal and desire. And these techniques come from a very specific term, a treasure, or a revealed scripture, the Yogic Householder, which Dr. Nida is a lineage holder and main sort of advocate for. And they're unusual because, like I said, normally in order to be prepared to really make the best of sexual energy as a sort of means of meditation, one had to have a lot of training in subtle body practice and physical yogas. It was typically also a sort of discipline that one would engage in when one was quite young and had a lot of sexual desire and a high libido.
Yeah.
So, like I said, historically, you would have training in inner heat or fire yoga and tummo. There were also very specific preliminary sort of training exercises for Karmamudra that involved the use of catheter training, sometimes shorthanded as Vajroli Mudra.
Oh yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Do you want to describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so often you'll hear that, no one's really qualified to do Karmamudra because Vajroli Mudra practice, sucking, there are different names for it in Tibetan. Called the,
I was told that when I first was introduced to Tibetan Buddhism. I remember hearing people say that you can't do Karmamudra unless you can suck a cup of milk up through your penis or something like that.
And it'll come out of your nostrils. It's sort of physiologically impossible task. And so, yeah, I mean, it is actually true that historically this has been a literal part of Karmamudra training. It's not just a blind or a ruse to throw off the uninitiated or to sort of build an impossible standard. And Jim Mallinson, who studies the history of yoga and Tantra in India, has written a really excellent article trying to understand, like, how did Vajroli Mudra emerge? And I talk about this a little bit in the dissertation.
It seems like it became a kind of unattainable ideal that closes the door to people.
Vajroli Mudra is still practiced in India it's typically practiced by ascetic, non-householder yogis. The idea that you can sort of, as he puts it, like, have your cake and eat it. And that because so many early Hatha yoga style practices were sort of centered on the binding and control of the bindu, of seminal essence. There was the idea that if you ejaculated, he mounts an argument, a persuasive argument for, often when you hear about Vajroli Mudra and catheter practice and sucking practices, it's usually in the context of yogis and yoginis are being trained to learn how to extract a kind of essence from sexual substances and bring it back up into the central channel in the body through the sexual organs. And that this kind of provides increased longevity or health or immortality. Now, what's interesting about, these practices are prohibited. Very few people train in them. They're very complex, very difficult, not exactly people's idea of a fun Saturday night either. Again, in the interview I was listening to with Ian Baker recently, he describes his encounter with one famous Tibetan Ngakpa, and when he expressed an interest in tsalung tigle practices, the internal subtle body yogic practices, this Ngakpa Kunsang Dorje Rinpoche in Nepal, his first sort of provocation was to pull a piece of copper wire from the shelf and said, "You want to learn? I'll teach you right now. Just place this in your urethra."
Jesus.
At the time, he didn't know. He didn't know that this wasn't just a sort of facetious test. That in fact, putting things inside your urethra and training that way was actually a part of the practice. But it was also a provocation from the sounds of it on the part of this highly trained Ngakpa. So the methods that we teach in this book are from the Yogic Householder scripture. And what's so interesting about the Yogic Householder as just as a text, as a collection of teachings from the 12th century. And
Right.
it's said to have been revealed or taught by the founder of Tibetan traditional medicine, one of the sort of founding figures, Yutok Yunten Gombo, the younger. There were two Yutoks. And, what's interesting is that this text, it's a highest yoga tantra text. It teaches the 3 inner yogas of the Nyingma classification. And it's a comprehensive set of teachings. It has its own special mundra, its own guru yoga sadhanas, highly differentiated ones. And it provides sort of everything a Vajrayana practitioner, really a ngakpa, like an engaged village specialist would need, who was also a doctor. So this is kind of like unique because it's a set of Vajrayana teachings that is especially pitched at kind of 12th century Tibetan working physicians who were householder yogis.
Part of what's so amazing about it is it is from the 12th century. It is this historical lineage, and it's kind of geared towards people who were physicians, who had a job, who had a family. And so it's so relevant to people today. And another amazing thing that you're probably about to get to is how it has versions of these practices for people who are also working and have other responsibilities that aren't so advanced, that don't, ways to go about connecting with Karmamudra practice without doing this extreme kind of catheter Vajra.
Right. So practice. The text is interesting because it quite the Yutak Nyintik has an unusually sort of detailed breakdown of Karmamudra practice and training, and it breaks that training into 2. On the one hand, there's training in this what Dr. Nida often calls the classical sense, the classical mode, which assumes that one will have mastered tumo, inner heat practice, that one will have done all of the sort of physical yogas and breathing exercises of true core. It then explains how to engage in catheter practice, and then outlines various gradual stages of training with both imagined sexual partners and various kinds of physical partners in the context of extensive closed retreat, where one is really just focusing exclusively on using sex and sexual arousal as a method of experiencing Mahamudra, which some listeners might be familiar with that term, experiencing, using Karmamudra as a gateway to Mahamudra. And then the text is interesting because it also says, look, for yogis who want to work with sexual yoga, who haven't mastered this tsalung and catheter training, here are some sort of alternative avenues, entry points, preliminary training that they can use. And then it also says, sort of in its typically flexible, sort of comprehensive, attentive to varying levels of expertise sort of way, it also then after that says, and if your sexual organs are defective, perhaps you're intersex, and it's difficult for you to engage in kind of heteronormative penetrative sexual intercourse, maybe you're old and your libido is very erratic or weak, maybe your subtle channels have been damaged after childbirth or surgery or something, and you just don't really feel that these practices are really working for you, that sort of the ship has sailed for engaging with these very intense kind of energy-based practices. It says then you can still just do Mahamudra practice without the sort of build-up of Karmamudra. Because historically, Karmamudra was sort of positioned in Vajrayana as producing a kind of energetic or mental condition in which perceiving, experiencing the direct, essential, ineffable experience of Mahamudra could happen more easily and in a more stable way. And then, of course, we see it, and I write about this in one chapter of the dissertation very broadly, but we see historically a complicated sort of movement away from an extreme emphasis on the absolute necessity for all of this complex, time-consuming tsalung, like a channel winds chakra type training, and then sort of the possibility that you can engage with Dzogchen practices, sort of unelaborated, less sort of more formless, direct practices without that basis,
right?
Or that there's other ways. That sexual yoga isn't kind of like historically sexual yoga has been seen as kind of one of the primary ways, at least in some schools of Buddhism in Tibet and India, as like a really important ingredient for being able to actualize the promise of Vajrayana,
right.
Which is experiencing complete Buddhahood or enlightenment while alive
in this body,
in a human body. And if not for sexual yoga, then often there would be talk about the death yoga. So in the during dying and in the bardo state, then there are opportunities too, and you can train for that in various ways. And then as time went on, sexual yoga kind of it involved a lot of factors that were a little bit awkward too for communities of monastics as well. So over time, we sort of see, I even cite a few great kind of commentators in my dissertation who over the centuries kind of almost start making fun of sexual yoga or people's hyper investment in it in the context of Tantric Buddhism, and say like, look, like, you could do all that and it might help you or have these sort of immediate provisional benefits, but there's so much capacity too to get sort of lost in that. And there's always this anxiety that people might forget the point, might forget the reason why they're doing this practice, because these sorts of meditative disciplines require a kind of cultivation of extraordinary levels of bliss in order to experience what Buddhists call the inseparable non-duality of bliss and emptiness.
That's their goal, right?
Right. It's not to experience the best orgasm of your life or even the incidental, maybe magical effects that can happen when one works with one's subtle body in this way. It's to experience the merging in an increasingly more profound, stable way of emptiness and bliss. Yeah. Just like one may do, just like when one does dream yoga, one learns to experience the inseparable emptiness of appearances, of arising perceptual appearances and emptiness. One understands that experientially, even if just for a moment. So
yeah, it's a great point. Well, you just named so many great things. But I remember a story I heard where someone asked Kalu Rinpoche, who's considered a great master of Mahamudra and everything. They said, well, there's all these different practices. Is it enough to just practice Mahamudra, just practice formless kind of sitting meditation? And he said, yeah, that's fine too. So it's like skillful means, skillful methods that you can use,
right? Like
to not get too fixated on them.
Right, and it's like I say, like people don't have the same sort of anxiety or difficulty with the idea of like. I often use the analogy of dream yoga as I've been doing because it doesn't have the same kind of fraught quality as sexual yoga.
Right?
Because someone can say, okay, well, I've always had a tendency to have very strong nightmares or really disturbing dreams, and then that's really good. Those people become really effective in many cases.
Yeah.
Dream yogis and yoginis, because that's part of their experience. That's the means that works, as Dr. Nida puts it in the book and in other places. Like Anuttara Tantra Yoga, Anuttara Yoga Tantra, highest Yoga Tantra, the inner yogas. They're really all about understanding what is our poison, what kleshas, what problems in samsaric living, what attachments and aversions do we have, and what poisons can become our talent, as he puts it, can become our opportunity.
Yeah, I love this idea of taking the things that you naturally want to do anyway and making that into your practice. And there were these, like I remember reading the stories of the 84 Mahasiddhas in India, these like, ancient masters, and One of them was, if I'm remembering correctly, like he was like a glutton, like he just loved to eat all the time.
Love to eat, yes.
So he met a tantric master who made that eating into his practice. So he let himself get big, let himself get fat, and yet he achieved enlightenment through that.
Right, but now the thing is, this is where I would intervene, and I would say, this is very attractive. It's very seductive. You know what we're saying. This tantric orientation of expedience, of nothing being rejected, and you know, kind of getting to embrace seemingly negative or distracting forces or impulses. And you know, like that particular Mahasiddha was able to turn eating or gluttony into a sadhana because the guru was able to effectively, according to the story, point out something to him so that when he ate, as the food went into his belly, he understood the dissolution of phenomena into emptiness. That's the kicker, right? That's the clincher. So there is this tendency in contemporary spirituality. You hear it a lot where people will say, wow, that really resonates with me. So I should do it. So it's spiritually meaningful. So it's right for me. Part of having spiritual mentors and teachers is that sometimes you don't want to be honest about what your poisons are or why you really want to do things. It sounds really great to be able to be spiritual while just never challenging ourselves or kind of never going against the grain of our experience or stepping out of it or anything like this. It's a subtle thing to be able to, you know, one needs to have a proper view and conduct if one is going to engage with, if one's going to engage with things like sensory desire and have them truly become a means on the path.
There's a lot of danger there, I guess, of fooling yourself, but the potential is there.
So this is again, why I often say, like, the best news maybe is that people read this and they go, that was super educational. And I just don't think sexual yoga is for me. And like I said, you know, it's easy for people to do this with dream yoga. They can say, well, yeah, it's easy for me to experience lucidity, for example. I've been experiencing lucidity my whole life, just, you know, without any training. So if I got some training in dream yoga, then I could really make use of that lucidity, not waste that opportunity. Or they may have been having terrible nightmares, but those become a means or an opportunity to experience lucidity for the first time. But for people who don't, it's less that that we cater to people's preferences in a samsaric way. And it's more just, it's almost like prescribing medicine, as Dr. Nida often says. If you have a student who, you know, is coming to a dream yoga class, but they don't like dreaming and they just can never quite seem to remember their dreams, and they're always experiencing maybe some other, you know, the color of their mental perceptual experiences is a bit different, then maybe they shouldn't be wasting their time kind of investing in a method or a medicine, a yogic discipline that doesn't quite click for them. And clicking doesn't always just mean that it caters to your sort of your ego-driven desires. It means that it works in the way that a medicine works, that it has efficacy for helping you with your problems. But yeah, so we put in this book some very, you know, the sort of first stages of Yutok's version of Karmamudra training that doesn't require that kind of a prior subtle body expertise. And we also included in here some sort of sexual yoga sadhanas which come out of a sort of more Ati yoga or Dzogchen orientation, where we also see over time in Tibetan context sort of a way of teaching, working with desire and bringing sensory desire on the path, which isn't hyper-focused on this kind of energy body cultivation. And sort of, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier because it's simpler. Just like with Dzogchen or Mahamudra practices in general, you know, it's like either you you see it, you get it, or you don't.
Simple but not easy. Yeah.
But yeah, so we've included some practical dimensions in this text. But I mean, I would really point out that, like, it's like I said, some people balked at the fact that we were saying, here's a book on Karmamudra, on the highest reaches of esoteric practice, and they couldn't believe that we would do such a thing as to reveal advanced secret practices. But the thing is, primarily this book is educational. It's provided to individuals who want to begin to think differently about desire and sexuality and in relation to spirituality. It's provided to sort of correct some common misunderstandings, to give a sort of lay of the land. It is certainly not pretending that it can teach anyone any kind of tantric yoga. No one can learn to do tantric yoga just from a book without supervision by a guru or the requisite transmissions. It's not our intention for this book to provide that, because, as I said, it's kind of an oxymoron that it even could. I'm pretty sure that if we called this book something else, interestingly, more Vajrayana practitioners would have read it. If Karmamudra wasn't in the title, they would have read it and probably had very little issue with what was being described. It's interesting. I know academics who, for the sake of their career advancement, who may not even be practitioners themselves, are translating texts and writing scholarly works which reveal much more information about sexual yoga practices. We thought carefully about what we would include and not include in this book. This is not an ill-considered production. We have other publications that we want to put out sooner than later, still on this theme. I think it's also useful to mention that this book is not just about the specific preliminary sexual yoga training exercises of one revealed scripture from the 12th century. It is that, but it's also a really great introduction to kind of the general orientation of Vajrayana for even for beginners.
It's a lot of useful, practical, helpful information.
My fear is that this is too specialized a topic, because I would. I wouldn't want people to think that, sexual yoga and sexuality are a really important part of Vajrayana, historically and in the present. But they're only one dimension of this wider kind of approach that I was talking about, to working with our own experience as ordinary people. As Nida has said, and this comes back to your earlier comments, so many people around the world today who are learning Tibetan medicine, Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan or non-Tibetan, they're not monks and nuns. And they're having sex, and it's more or less troubling to them or miring them more or less in samsara. It's more or less an important part of their everyday life. They're having sexual experiences and sensory desire with their partners and so on. And yet they feel like they don't know how to talk to their lamas or teachers about those things. And they don't know what's even possible for them in terms of, engaging with those embodied, inevitable parts of their experience as Buddhists. So
it's kind of ironic that, like, the images of Buddhas, the Yab-Yum, male-female Buddha, it's so representative of Tibetan Buddhism. If you say, that's kind of the first thing a lot of people will think about, or what draws them to the practice, perhaps. But then as you get more into it, I think these taboos kind of come online even more, and it's a little bit ironic. But I loved what you said about not spiritualizing sex, that part of it is realizing the equality of all things, taking away some of the charge from it, perhaps. So it can just be a part of your life.
This is something, as a scholar, I still struggle to sort of articulate, because it would be a little bit misrepresentative to say that sex has no special status in the context of some non-dual tantric traditions. Certainly, it has a sort of quality a set of connotations or a role to play. But I think a lot of people, I try to underemphasize that, though, because I think in the neo-tantric, new age tantric kind of world, it's
overemphasized.
Right. There's sort of this idea, sexual yoga only makes sense if you understand, sort of the underlying or internal logic of any other sort of non-dual tantric yoga discipline. And dream yoga, working with other afflictive emotions. And of course, every one of these disciplines have their special qualities or unique training involved or opportunities. Sexual yoga historically, like I said, has been very associated with the revelation of Dharma scriptures, and it's enabled kind of an open canon of Tibetan scripture. The possibility of new teachings appearing at any time. So it keeps an open-ended scriptural canon. It's also been historically quite associated with practices for longevity and improved health. It also has
the practice of longevity, I've heard it criticized that older lamas will use the practice to try to extend their life, but then I've heard people criticize that because it sounds like a kind of sexual vampirism where you are extracting the energy, and that's kind of a thing that's become a little bit in our popular culture, that sometimes women are seen that way, that they can be like a sexual vampire. I mean, it could be a man or a woman or any gender, but that you can kind of take someone's energy somehow. And
right. I mean, this is kind of the stereotype of the dodgy, unscrupulous yogi in tantric yogi in India and Tibet, more so in India. The idea that the yogi has got a sort of harem of younger women, and he's sort of sucking out their life force to extend his life. And it is true that there are cases where older lamas who have more authority and power in society have engaged in Karmamudra practice with younger women. And part of the justification of that has been, to extend their life. I actually have, maybe I'll read it. I have a sort of indigenous critic. Many people who are familiar with the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism will know Jimipam. And he was a monastic, but he wrote this kind of joking text for a friend. I cited briefly in my dissertation, where he's sort of gently making fun of the tendencies amongst the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, only in a very elegant fashion to sort of then go on and say they're actually all great in their own way, and we should respect all of them. But he's really a non-sectarian in a deep way. But
what is the book that you're holding there?
This is just a printout of my dissertation.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So here is his quote he's sort of stereotyping and making fun of Nyingma lamas, typically Nyingma Ngakpa and treasure revealers who might be married and be householders. So he says, Nyingma lamas, while accepting that there is the path of clear light, great perfection, or Dzogchen, in which one may attain the level of Vajradhara Buddha without relying on things like an external Karmamudra or tantric sex partner, they nonetheless say, so even though in the Nyingma context there's this kind of doctrinal recognition that you don't need to practice with a physical tantric sex partner to attain Buddhahood in this life, you can do Dzogchen practice without. He says, even though these lamas accept this, these Nyingma lamas, they nonetheless say that lamas should make use of women to increase their lifespans, improve their eyesight, be free of sickness, and to reveal beneficial treasure teachings for the sake of sentient beings.
A lot of good benefits.
Yet they don't say they need to teach and practice for the sake of the teachings just themselves. It seems really amazing, really incredible to me that partnered tantric sexual yoga could fulfill the function of benefiting the teachings and sentient beings and of furthering both instruction and practice of Buddha Dharma, and of improving one's eyesight, all at the same time. How wonderful. So he's gently making fun of this idea that people might sort of have vested worldly interests in engaging with these things, and it can be a bit self-serving. So there's definitely cases of that.
Be hypocritical.
My colleague Sarah Jacoby, who's just done fantastic work around female treasure revealers, and one in particular, Sarah Kundra, who's a great Karmamudra, female Karmamudra partner. Sarah Kundra talks in her biography of sort of being passed around to older lamas as a yogini trained in sexual yoga precisely for this purpose, because they need to reveal a treasure or they are having health problems. But interestingly, she also talks about seeking out younger, appropriate male partners herself when she needs, these same benefits when she's experiencing obstacles or sickness. It's just that we very rarely hear about these practices written from the vantage point of woman and women's bodies, because the society in which this knowledge was valued was so sort of male-centric, patriarchal.
Right.
But it doesn't mean, though.
One of the misconceptions you list in the book is that Karmamudra is patriarchal. It only exists to exploit and abuse women and empower heterosexual men. And, you and Dr. Nida argues in this book that's a misconception.
Right. It's not a misconception that that's how it could go, right?
It could go, right.
That's how it's gone because of the context in which these practices are being kept alive or prioritized.
But the actual practice, the actual teachings aren't necessarily that way.
Honestly, there's nothing that I can see in these, because there has been a trend. And I honestly think it's just because of limited exposure on the parts of some scholars. But some non-Tibetan scholars especially have sort of written sexual yoga off entirely. I mentioned some personal experiences I had with other scholars who just didn't really even want to talk about the details of sexual yoga because they'd already made up their minds that it was all just somehow a kind of cultural contrivance that only really had its only real significance was to sort of enable male dominance within a particular kind of power structure.
Very cynical view.
I think it is a cynical view, but I also think it's a view that many people can be forgiven for. Dr. Nida, as a sort of indigenous spokesperson of this tradition, is really on the corrective here. He doesn't like the way that this is what's become of these practices. He wants to see he wants to see people engaging more differently in a more inclusive and beneficial way with these sorts of things. He really encourages women, for example, like he's always very interested in sharing anecdotes about yoginis in Tibet, female practitioners who have chosen to do these kinds of practices by themselves without male partners. He really wants to emphasize that these sorts of meditative disciplines can be used by people other than men, powerful, straight, cisgendered men. That's why in the book one of the most beautiful aspects of my relationship with Dr. Nida is he is a cisgendered, straight man. I am not. And, he doesn't have a lot of experience with queer sexuality and queer community necessarily, but he and I have had a lot of conversations. Me as a queer practitioner of Vajrayana about desire and about, because one really striking feature of Tibetan sexual yoga texts, even more than Indian Shaiva texts, I think, is that they're really heteronormative. Really heteronormative. You see virtually even a whiff of possibility. Actually, the Yutak Nyintik has a very interesting line, which sort of indirectly suggests that intersex individuals or individuals who are transgender potentially could be practicing these practices at a high level, but it's a very throwaway comment. In the Indian Shaiva materials, you often see a kind of more formulaic recognition of the three types of practitioners, male-bodied, female-bodied, and something else.
That's interesting that it names that something else, because that's kind of rare maybe in more traditional sources.
I suspect that we see this less in Buddhist Tantra because of the influence of how Buddhist monastics and monastic scholastics have addressed the question of third gender individuals, sexual deviance, pandaka, as it's called in scriptural sources. But so yeah, it is really kind of remarkable. We see very little evidence of women writing from their own perspective or even from their own bodies. Even when they're writing text, they may still reproduce a kind of heteronormative male-centric position. It's interesting, Dr. Nida has suggested that part of the reason for this is that men actually require more help, that women are actually more, women are better at yoga. And sexual yoga, and men actually need more work. They need more instruction and more help.
That's interesting.
So, Shaman Hatley has written a really fascinating article from the Shaiva Tantric context, where he looks at an early Tantric text and the evidence we can read between the lines of female experts, of Shaktis, Dutis, of female sex partners in the Shaiva context, and sort of little glimpses we see of the fact that they had whole worlds, probably hereditary mother-daughter family context, householder context. They had whole worlds of expertise and training, which never made it onto the page because only men were writing about how they needed to interact with women and sort of garner some kind of benefits from those women's expertise, which we never hear spoken of.
Like it could be more of an oral tradition.
Right. So, there's so much we don't know about women's experience. And then beyond that also, we see very little indication at all that people, it's sort of just assumed that sexual yoga with a physical partner, you have a man who's visualizing himself as a male yidam, who's arising as a conventionally masculine Buddha, and a yogini who's arising as a female Buddha, and that there is a penis and there is a vagina, and they're coming together. And it's interesting though, because on the other hand, as Dr. Nida points out, Vajrayana is all about recognizing that our physical composite body is impermanent and mirage-like, and when we practice deity yoga and tantric yoga, we are learning how to divest from and dissolve our incredible attachments to that idea of ourself and of our body. We're experiencing death and rebirth through yogic discipline. And when we imagine ourselves as yidams, those yidams are empty and made of light and don't possess any of the organs or limitations of ordinary human bodies. And it's not only possible, but totally normal and expected that, karmically male-bodied practitioners may visualize themselves as a female yidam or meditational Buddha and vice versa. So Nida explains in one section of the book, advice for, queer practitioners, transgender practitioners, homosexual practitioners. If you really understand kind of the internal logic or point of these practices, you'll see that there's actually nothing inherent in the thinking behind these practices that should disqualify somebody from working with their sensory arisings and desire to learn about their nature, just because, it can be very dispiriting. Like I've seen, I'm aware of many people in the kind of neo-tantric world, like queer teachers and authors who have felt that it was necessary to kind of invent or write texts or practices that were sort of amenable to queer people. I certainly know from personal experience going to, receiving instruction in Western sexual magic practices or neo-tantric practices, there is often a incredibly heteronormative sort of mood and a kind of a sort of spiritualization or sort of almost like celebration of what to me are largely historically arbitrary or culturally contingent ideas about gender roles,
Right.
or sex or things. Sorry. Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if my battery was just blinking at me, but you often see in these communities that there's almost a kind of glorification of what to me just seems like cultural contrivance. And in classical tantra, we don't. I mean, this is a much bigger topic, and there's grounds for arguments back and forth on this. But in classical tantra, we don't really see a kind of cosmology of gender and of sexual roles in the same way, a sort of cosmologization of these things as we do in New Age tantra. And like you could be forgiven for looking at the scope of texts and teachings and out there in Vajrayana and feeling like, yeah, this isn't really something for, women who love women or men who love men,
Right,
or non-binary individuals. But Dr. Nida is really trying to alert people to the fact that if you understand the kind of point of these practices, you realize that like there's no reason that transgender individuals can't also use sexual meditation on the spiritual path, that they can't apply that to be relevant to their own embodied experience of desire. So,
I mean, Dr. Nida is great at encouraging people to be, adapt it to their situation and circumstances. And I think it's a good point you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very pleased that we could. I think there's more that could be said, but I was glad that we could put a section in there that at least touched on those points, because I just knew from my own experience that a lot of queer people sort of felt a little bit alienated or confused, like by just sort of the predominance of heteronormative imagery and sort of sentiments.
I've heard many people talk about how one of the things that modern contemporary culture can offer to some of these ancient traditions is creating more inclusive language and around all these kinds of issues. And it's not that it was totally absent in the past, but maybe, like you're saying, a lot of the people who were actually writing the text were men. Maybe they were in a monastery, and so there's a lot of factors.
Right. And I think just in general, as a scholar of religion, like for me, as an anthropologist of religion kind of the heart of religion is in the meeting of living, historically positioned practitioners and their texts, their authoritative sources and experiences. Like people will often say things like, the Bible says, or Buddhism teaches that. And the thing is, really, at the end of the day, we only have practitioners in their own context who are engaging with texts and teachers and practices and understanding their meaning. So we can, this is the work of kind of engaged theology, right? We can, like, here's an example. My colleague, Jose Cabazon, has written wonderfully about this as an ex-monk, Gelugpa monk, and queer individual himself. He's written about the sexuality and desire and how it's represented in South Asian sort of classical Buddhism, sort of not really tantric sources, but he points out that foundational scriptures of Buddhism, mutually recognized by every school of Buddhism, denounce all forms of sex for lay people other than penis penetrating vagina, usually for the sake of procreation. And I mean, how many non-heritage Buddhists who've come to Tibetan Buddhism are living sexual lives that follow that rule?
Not very many.
And they're not hearing about it because their lamas aren't telling them about it, because they don't think it's important, because they've decided, as holders of these traditions and adapters of these traditions to new communities, that, the Dalai Lama's had a really interesting balancing act where he's been pressed for the last few decades on these questions. Like I think in kind of the 90s, people really started realizing, oh shit, like this tradition we entered into has some really like particular ideas about sexual misconduct that we had no idea about. And so we were very troubled by this. And so they were approaching the Dalai Lama and saying like, okay, well, what does Buddhism say about homosexual desire? What does Buddhism say? I mean, to his enormous credit, he said, well, I'm a monk in the Gelugpa school, and all I can tell you to answer that question is what our authoritative texts say. And, but then again, to his enormous credit, he then did one better. He said, but I also understand that, the context in which I'm speaking from, and then the context of others who are asking these questions. And we have to think about how we apply doctrinal or historical precedents and theological positions to the everyday experiences of people today. And that's a kind of hallmark of Buddhism, at least in its branding, is that it is about doing that. That Buddha beings are those beings. Yeah, they're those beings who have such incredibly efficacious, skillful means, such a capacity to subdue beings as they need to be subdued, to work with and tame and overcome sources of suffering, and make Buddhist practices amenable and individuals amenable to them. So, I think in general, this is for me what a living religious tradition is about. It's about thinking about looking at your authoritative sources and not just saying the Bible said. I mean, if it was true that that's all that religious interpretation entailed, we wouldn't have Christians who were quoting Jesus to justify liberation theology and the benefits of socialism, at the same time that we have other Christians who are saying that capitalism is God ordained. So,
this is difference in debate,
and so we have to. It's the same applies to Vajrayana teachings. Individual lamas and interpreters and practitioners are looking at the texts and they're looking at historical precedent and cultural practice and institutions, and they're thinking, okay, well, just like the Dalai Lama's, increasingly strong comments about reforming the Tuku institution in Tibetan Himalayan societies, or it's
another big topic.
So it's much the same with sexuality and desire.
Absolutely.
These questions are coming up again in light of what you've mentioned, these sort of instances of abuse within sanghas, and the sort of sometimes convenient use of the sort of label of Tantra to justify this behavior.
That's exactly why this book is so helpful, I think. So
right. Well, you have a lama who has sort of grounds to speak authoritatively in these traditions, saying, from where I'm standing, I don't really see that behavior as being justified, in terms of these practices or these precedents. So this is part of a living tradition. It's part of a community of practitioners who are going to respond in different ways based on these different sources, their own experience, their historical shifts, authoritative texts, and new texts, and so it's a dynamic process. And I'm just pleased to have been a small part of getting some of Dr. Nida's insights on this important topic out there, and we're going to continue to do that in the future.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I want to encourage you with that, and I look forward to future publications. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you have found this podcast valuable, please consider supporting it. Visit patreon.com/astateofmind to send us a donation. Every dollar really counts. You can share about it on your social media accounts, share it with friends. Feel free to send me emails, messages about it, thoughts, concerns, questions. To learn more about my work as a therapist, meditation teacher, and coach, visit julianocean.us. And we have more information about the podcast and about each episode at astateofmindplay.com. I'll see you here next time. L'amor